Energy did not disappear. It was rerouted. In less than 12 months, the United States lost access to 3.6 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day. Not because of war, not because of sabotage, but because the flow changed direction. January 2025, Canada sends roughly 9 billion cubic feet of natural gas south every single day. Quiet, reliable, taken for granted. By the start of 2026, that number falls to 5.4. This is not a slowdown. This is collapse. 40% of Canadian gas exports to the United States gone. No press conference, no emergency session, no public alarm. Just a silent subtraction from the system that heats homes, powers factories, and stabilizes prices. And the trigger is not a mystery. August, tariffs. 35% on Canadian goods, announced loudly, marketed as leverage, framed as strength. The assumption was simple. Canada needs the American market more than America needs Canadian energy. That assumption was wrong. What followed was not retaliation in public. There were no threats, no speeches, no dramatic walkouts. Canada did not argue. Canada adjusted. Pipelines changed priority. Contracts changed destination. Ships turned west instead of south. Trade pressure became energy pressure. Energy pressure became price pressure. Price pressure became leverage loss. This is how modern power shifts now. Quietly. Through infrastructure. Through contracts that do not expire with election cycles. The shock is not that Canada found other buyers. The shock is that it did so faster than Washington expected, and with less noise than anyone noticed. An energy superpower does not usually wake up to discover that its most reliable supplier has already moved on. But that is exactly what happened here. So the question is no longer about tariffs, or trade disputes, or rhetoric. The question is simpler, colder. Can an energy superpower afford to lose its most reliable supplier? Tariffs are not new. The thinking behind them is older than the pipelines they were meant to pressure. The logic is blunt. If you control access to the largest market on Earth, you can force compliance, raise the cost, apply pain, extract concessions. This is the zero-sum worldview. One side wins because the other side cannot afford to lose. That logic only works when dependency runs one way. In Washington, the assumption was clear. Canada sells, America buys. End of story. Energy flows south because it has always flowed south. Pipelines exist. Geography is fixed. Markets are permanent. That assumption confused habit with necessity. Canada was framed as a junior partner, a resource supplier with no real exit. Too cold, too distant, too infrastructure-bound to matter outside North America. Tariffs, under this view, were leverage. Pressure that could be dialed up or down at will. But leverage depends on one thing above all else, the absence of alternatives. And alternatives already existed. Asian demand for natural gas had been rising for years. European markets had learned, painfully, what energy weaponization looks like. Long-term buyers were searching for stable supply from countries that did not use exports as political threats. Canada fit that profile precisely. The zero-sum trap was assuming that dependence was static, that pipelines were destiny, that contracts were loyalty. In reality, dependence is dynamic. It shifts the moment incentives change. When tariffs were announced, the calculation in Ottawa was not emotional, it was structural. If trade policy could swing this sharply, then reliance on a single buyer was no longer prudent, it was dangerous. This is where coercive trade logic backfires. It does not scare partners into submission, it teaches them risk. The louder the pressure, the clearer the lesson. Diversify now or pay later. Tariffs were meant to demonstrate strength. Instead, they revealed fragility. They exposed how much of American energy security rested not on domestic production alone, but on the quiet cooperation of a neighbor that had options. And once those options are activated, leverage does not return on command. The zero-sum trap is believing power is something you can threaten with. In modern energy systems, power is something others can walk away from. Canada did not respond the way Washington expected. There was no escalation cycle, no retaliatory tariffs announced in prime time, no attempt to win the news cycle, no emotional counterpunch. Instead, Canada went quiet. This is known in strategic circles as the grey rock approach. No reaction, no engagement, no visible conflict, only movement where it matters. While the tariffs dominated headlines, the real response unfolded in spreadsheets, permits, and shipping schedules. Decisions made without cameras, actions that did not require explanation. The first shift was operational. Natural gas, that had long been assumed to flow south, was reprioritized. Export volumes were adjusted, not cut in a single dramatic move, but steadily reduced as alternative routes came online. At the same time, long-delayed infrastructure stopped waiting. Liquefied natural gas facilities on the West Coast moved from planning to execution. Capacity that had existed on paper for years became physical reality. Processing units came online. Shipping schedules were finalized. The westbound option stopped being theoretical. Contracts followed infrastructure. Asian buyers, already searching for stable supply, stepped in quickly. They were not negotiating month to month. They were locking in volumes for decades, 15 years, 20 years. Agreements designed to survive political cycles and ignore tariff threats entirely. Canada did not announce a pivot away from the United States. It never needed to. It simply created a second spine for its energy economy. This distinction matters. Retaliation seeks to punish. Immunity seeks to protect. What Canada built was not a counterattack, it was insulation. The contrast in leadership styles was impossible to miss. In Washington, the strategy was performative. Loud signals, public pressure. The assumption that dominance is demonstrated by confrontation. In Ottawa, the strategy was procedural. Permits accelerated, approvals streamlined. Projects that had stalled for years moved forward with unusual speed. No speeches were required. Infrastructure speaks for itself. This is where the energy security inversion becomes visible. For decades, American energy planning treated Canadian supply as a constant, a stabilizer, a shock absorber. When domestic production dipped or demand spiked, Canadian gas filled the gap, quietly, reliably. That assumption inverted the moment Canadian supply found higher-paying, lower-risk buyers elsewhere. Energy security is not measured by how much you produce. It is measured by how resilient your supply chains are when conditions change. By rerouting gas west, Canada did not weaken itself. It reduced exposure. It diversified risk. It converted dependence into optionality. The United States, meanwhile, discovered that domestic production alone does not insulate prices. Markets are interconnected. Supply gaps transmit pressure instantly. Remove 3.6 billion cubic feet per day from the system, and the effect ripples outward. The loss is not just volume, it is flexibility. When energy systems lose flexibility, they lose time. They lose room to maneuver. They lose the ability to absorb shocks without passing costs downstream. This is why the grey rock strategy is so effective. It denies the aggressor the feedback they expect. There is no visible fight to win, no opponent to dominate, only a system that quietly stops cooperating. Canada's response was not framed as defiance, it was framed as prudence, a reasonable adjustment to an unreliable environment. That framing is devastatingly effective, because once a move is categorized as risk management rather than retaliation, reversing it becomes irrational. You do not reintroduce vulnerability just to prove a point. This is the part that is often missed. Even if tariffs disappear tomorrow, the logic that produced this shift remains. The lesson has already been learned. Dependence on a single buyer is exposure. Exposure invites pressure. Pressure demands exits. Canada found its exits, and it did so without shouting, without threats, and without asking permission. This is how power moves now. not through confrontation, but through quiet re-engineering of the system itself. By the time the noise fades, the architecture has already changed. Energy shifts do not announce themselves at the kitchen table. They arrive later. In invoices, in margins, in decisions that used to be easy. When Canadian supply began thinning, the first signal was not panic, it was pricing. Wholesale benchmarks ticked upward, then they stayed there. Then they climbed again. 3.6 billion cubic feet per day removed from a tightly balanced system does not vanish quietly, it pushes outward. Utilities compete harder for supply, industrial buyers hedge at higher levels. Retail rates follow with a delay that feels harmless until winter arrives. In the Midwest, that delay closed. Natural gas heats nearly half of American homes. When prices rise, the effect is mechanical. Bills increase. There is no substitute switch to flip, no discretionary usage to cut without consequences. For households already absorbing inflation elsewhere, energy becomes the line item that cannot be ignored. $50 more per month becomes $75, then $100. Spread across a season, the difference is not abstract. It is groceries postponed, repairs deferred, credit used where cash once sufficed. This is not a story of outrage, it is a story of arithmetic. Manufacturing feels it faster. Energy-intensive businesses operate on thin spreads. When natural gas doubles from its previous floor, margins compress instantly. What was once manageable becomes unsustainable. Plants do not shut down dramatically, they slow, shifts are reduced, maintenance is postponed. Hiring freezes appear before layoffs do. In places like Iowa and Ohio, small and mid-sized manufacturers do not have the luxury of long-term fixed energy contracts. They buy closer to market. They absorb volatility directly. When energy costs rise faster than output prices, the math breaks. This is where the policy distance collapses. Tariffs imposed in Washington become line items in the Midwest. Not through trade statistics, but through payroll decisions. A policy designed to pressure a foreign government begins pressuring domestic employers instead. And this is how the feedback loop forms. Higher energy costs translate into voter frustration, not ideological, practical. Heating bills are not debated, they are paid. When they rise, explanations are demanded. Governors hear it first, then legislators, then party leadership. The political response is predictable. Calls for relief. Requests for exemptions. Quiet objections from within the same coalition that supported the tariffs initially. This is not defiance, it is damage control. The feedback loop tightens further when manufacturing joins the conversation. Energy costs are not a partisan issue on the factory floor. They are an operational constraint. When facilities begin losing competitiveness to foreign plants with lower input costs, the consequences spread. Orders shift, investments pause. Regions that rely on steady industrial employment feel the pressure before national data catches up. This is the part rarely captured in headline analysis. Energy policy does not hurt evenly. It concentrates pain in specific geographies. Cold states. Industrial corridors. Swing regions where elections are decided on margins, not narratives. The irony is quiet but sharp. The tariffs were sold as a show of strength. A demonstration that economic pressure could be applied without domestic cost. That assumption holds only if supply chains remain cooperative. Once cooperation ends, the pressure reverses direction. Canada's reduced exports did not target American households intentionally. They did not need to. Markets did the work. Prices adjusted. Costs transmitted. Pain localized where political sensitivity is highest. This is the difference between retaliation and consequence. Retaliation announces itself. Consequence accumulates. By the time voters begin asking why their heating bills have climbed so sharply, the structural cause is already locked in. There is no single executive order that reverses it, no speech that restores lost supply. This is where the political calculus changes. Pressure that was meant to travel outward begins traveling inward. The same system designed to coerce an ally starts disciplining its own architects. And once that realization spreads, the conversation shifts, not toward escalation, but toward reassessment, because the cost is no longer theoretical, it is already being paid. The most decisive shifts are rarely visible. They do not arrive with announcements or ceremonies. They arrive as steel poured into place, as contracts signed quietly, as logistics systems that stop pointing where they used to. This is where reversal becomes impossible. While debate focused on tariffs and rhetoric, a parallel system was taking shape, not to pressure the United States, to replace it. Liquefied natural gas terminals are not policy instruments. They are physical commitments. Once built, they demand utilization. They require throughput. They lock behavior into the structure itself. On Canada's west coast, that structure hardened quickly, processing capacity expanded, shipping schedules filled, buyers committed volumes years in advance. These were not contingency arrangements, they were foundations. At the same time, long-term contracts erased ambiguity. 15-year agreements do not wait for election outcomes. 20-year supply commitments do not adjust to diplomatic moods. They exist to eliminate uncertainty. For both sides, once those contracts are signed, gas does not drift back toward old markets out of nostalgia. It goes where the obligation is, where the price is, where the risk is lower. This is the infrastructure lock-in. Energy systems do not pivot on sentiment. They pivot on sunk cost. Pipelines, terminals, and shipping lanes are directional. Once flows are optimized in one direction, reversing them is not a political choice. It is an engineering problem, a capital problem, a time problem. And time is the one asset that cannot be accelerated. The United States could lift tariffs tomorrow. It could normalize trade rhetoric. It could reassert diplomatic warmth. None of that rebuilds optionality once it is gone. Because the critical change is not the volume lost today, it is the capacity no longer available tomorrow. When Canadian gas flowed south, it served as a buffer, a release valve, a margin of safety when demand surged or domestic supply faltered. That buffer absorbed shocks invisibly. Now it does not. What replaced it is not an equivalent substitute. Domestic production responds slowly. Imports from elsewhere are limited. Infrastructure cannot be summoned on demand. The system tightens. This is the ghost train effect. Energy still moves, ships still sail, trains still run, but they no longer arrive where planners assumed they always would. From the perspective of American energy security, the loss is subtle but profound. Not dominance, not prestige, flexibility. Flexibility is what allows systems to correct without pain. When it disappears, every disruption transmits cost immediately. This is why the shift is irreversible in practical terms. Even if new capacity is built domestically, it will arrive into a market that has already repriced risk. Investors, utilities, and buyers now operate under a different assumption set. Canadian supply is no longer guaranteed, it is optional. And options carry premiums. The defeat here is not dramatic. There is no single moment of collapse. There is only a narrowing corridor of choices. Trade leverage, once assumed to be permanent, has been converted into a temporary bargaining chip that expired the moment alternatives matured. The ghost train does not announce its departure. You notice it only when you realize it is no longer scheduled to return. And by then, the tracks have already been rerouted. This story does not end with outrage. It ends with arithmetic. Tariffs were deployed as a tool of dominance. They were meant to remind an ally where the center of gravity sat. Instead, they accelerated a lesson Canada had already begun to absorb. Dependence is a liability. The data is unambiguous. Energy flows changed, contracts locked, infrastructure hardened. What once moved by habit now moves by design. The United States did not lose resources. It lost margin. It lost flexibility. It lost the quiet advantage of having a neighbor willing to absorb shocks without demanding a premium. That loss will not show up all at once. It will surface during cold winters, during tight markets, during negotiations where leverage was once assumed and now has to be proven. The broader implication is harder to ignore. Allies are watching, not the rhetoric, but the outcomes. They are learning which relationships reduce risk and which introduce it. Coercion creates exits. Stability creates alignment. Energy systems remember this long after political cycles move on. The recalibration is already underway. The only remaining question is whether the lesson travels faster than the damage. Send this to someone who still believes allies are optional.